A respected black surgeon's attempt to bring vital healthcare to an underserved community is met with blatant racism and systemic obstruction. Authorities cast him as a threat, with a hostile officer spreading false accusations and city officials quietly backing his intimidation. Instead of acknowledging medical need, those in power stoke fear, weaponize bureaucratic rules, and rely on racist stereotypes to maintain control. The community's frustration boils as each move to improve lives is twisted into a cause for suspicion, leaving the audience outraged at the injustice and prejudice on display. On a humid summer morning in Fulton City, Dr. Adrian Carter stepped out of his hybrid sedan and into a world that knew his name but seldom knew his face. The car, a sleek pearl-white piece of German engineering, contrasted with the rundown strip of businesses along Marietta Avenue. Adrian didn't mind the sharp dissonance. He had chosen this neighborhood diner, the Magnolia Spoon, for a reason. It was small, family-owned, and never too crowded on weekdays. But more than that, it was a place where he could be just another customer, sipping coffee, not the figure whose name graced medical journals and nonprofit reports. From a distance, few would guess the quiet man about to enter was a leading neurosurgeon at Latham Memorial Hospital, or that he had recently launched a scholarship fund that would send dozens of underprivileged kids to college on full rides, or that, as a result of his careful investments and a seat on the board of a major biotech firm, he was wealthy beyond the dreams of most people who passed him on the street. Those details rarely mattered to Adrian. When he moved through the world, he preferred jeans over suits, a faded polo over starched collars, and a pair of sensible loafers rather than polished Oxfords. He'd grown up in a working-class family, 2 neighborhoods over, where humility was woven into his upbringing. Even after his rise to prominence, he'd kept the modest home his parents left him, renovated, but not ostentatious. He still mowed his own lawn when he had the time, trimmed the rose bushes out front, and greeted neighbors by name. Today, he needed a quiet corner and a cup of black coffee. He would be meeting a local youth advocate and a city council liaison here in about half an hour to discuss expanding his philanthropic project. The Carter Fellows Program, aimed at training the next generation of black physicians and healthcare leaders. It was vital work, especially given the city's recent wave of racially charged confrontations and the quiet but persistent hum of systemic injustices. Just last week, a news report had highlighted discrepancies in the city's hospital funding, some wards flourishing while others struggled with outdated equipment. Adrian's hospital was top tier, but he'd noticed the pattern of which communities received the best care and which were left behind. That was part of why he came here, to work from the grassroots, to connect with the community on a human level. He pushed open the diner's smudged glass door. A tiny bell jingled overhead. Inside, the air smelled of hot grease, maple syrup, and something burnt lingering at the edges. Vinyl booths lined one wall, their cushions cracked and duct-taped, each table topped with a plastic vase of faded silk flowers. Behind the counter, a single waitress and a short-order cook handled the morning's slow trickle of patrons. Adrian chose a booth by the window, preferring to watch the world outside as he waited. At this hour, the sidewalks held a medley of people: a construction crew gearing up 2 blocks down, a nurse rushing to catch the bus, a tired grocery clerk pushing a stubborn shopping cart toward the corner store. The city hummed with life, but not all that life was treated equally. He'd seen it in the way security guards at upscale boutiques would tail a black customer for no reason, in how certain neighborhoods seemed invisible when it came to municipal improvements, and in the side glances he received when wearing sweatpants and a ball cap at a high-end restaurant. True, he was powerful in some circles. He could walk into a hospital board meeting and have surgeons lean forward to hear his opinion. He could call up a venture capitalist and have them return his voicemail within 10 minutes. Yet the world outside those bubbles did not always see him that way. A few minutes passed. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a fraying ponytail, had glanced at him once, then promptly attended to a white couple who entered after him. They slid into a booth nearby, and she was at their side within seconds, pad at the ready, a sympathetic tilt to her posture. Adrian watched with a calm, steady gaze. He knew the subtle difference in service well. It had followed him all his life, even as his net worth soared and his reputation solidified. No matter how many awards he accrued or scholarships he funded, To some people, he was still just another black man who might or might not belong. He turned his attention to the laminated menu. The edges were sticky, and the breakfast specials were cheap, 3 eggs and toast for less than he'd pay in parking downtown. He didn't mind the place's roughness. If anything, he appreciated the honesty of its wear and tear. This diner, unlike the glossy restaurants he'd recently attended for fundraisers, wasn't pretending to be more than it was. He just wished the service matched the warmth advertised by the fading, sun-bleached posters of grinning families on the walls. After another couple of minutes, Adrian cleared his throat softly and raised a hand. The waitress, whose name tag said Carlene, huffed quietly, though he couldn't be sure if it was about him or something else, and approached. "Something you need?" she asked, voice flat. "Just coffee, please, Black," Adrian said, a gentle smile on his face. He made sure to keep his tone polite and easy. "And I'll probably get breakfast in a bit, waiting for some people." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Right, be back." Then she turned on her heel and disappeared behind the counter. Adrian watched her go, turning the interaction over in his mind. He'd learned long ago not to jump to conclusions too quickly. Some folks were just having a bad day. But the difference between how she greeted the other couple and how she addressed him stung. If only a little. He exhaled quietly. He could have revealed who he was, Dr. Carter, eminent surgeon, community benefactor. But that wasn't the point. He didn't want better treatment because of his status. He wanted to be seen and respected as a person, plain and simple. Outside the window, the day was brightening. A cluster of pigeons strutted near a trash bin. Across the street, a billboard advertised a new line of luxury condos that no one in this neighborhood could likely afford. Adrian's mind drifted to the meeting ahead. He would be sitting down with Ms. Jackson, a community organizer whose grassroots clinic had been struggling, and Mr. Bentley from the city council's office, who seemed eager to partner on a pilot program. Adrian was hoping to secure a site where they could run a health awareness camp, maybe a mobile clinic to serve underinsured families. He had the funds. What he needed was the city's support and Ms. Jackson's community connections. When Carlene returned with his coffee, she placed it on the table with a small clink, as if putting down something heavier than a mug. "Anything else?" she asked tersely, her gaze drifting just over his shoulder. "Not yet, thank you," he replied with patience. "I'm meeting a couple of people, and we'll order then." She shrugged and headed back to the counter. Adrian sipped his coffee, thin, a bit bitter, and exactly what he needed. He let the mild discomfort of the situation settle. Perhaps she was simply cautious of strangers. Dressed casually, he might resemble any local, but maybe not the type she expected to spend much money here. The subtle biases that crept into ordinary interactions were what truly bothered him, more than overt acts of racism. It was these quiet, almost invisible slights that could wear a person down over time. Another customer entered. A young black man in a neatly pressed work uniform, probably an assistant at one of the nearby law firms. He took a seat at the counter, and Adrian observed Carlene's reception of him. She handed him a menu without comment, but at least she didn't keep him waiting as long. Adrian wondered if she was warming up, or simply realized she needed to maintain some semblance of service. Across the aisle, the white couple was now laughing softly with each other, their plates already steaming with scrambled eggs and ham. Adrian's stomach growled quietly. He considered ordering something small before his colleagues arrived, but decided against it. He wanted to break bread with them as a group, to start their conversation over a shared meal. Besides, it wasn't hunger that weighed on him the most. It was the feeling that he had to continually prove himself, or remain gracious, despite being undervalued. He let his thoughts drift to his parents. They had raised him to keep his head high, to work diligently, and to never forget where he came from. His father's words echoed in his memory. "Respect yourself first, son. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Growing up in these very streets, he learned early that the world might not give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, as a wealthy and influential man, he hoped his success would help shape a better environment for others. Maybe smoother interactions at diners in the future, or broader social changes that dismantled these old prejudices, one policy at a time. Adrian glanced at his watch. Ms. Jackson should be arriving soon. She was a force of nature, someone who had spent decades fighting for the underserved. He looked forward to seeing her reaction to the magnolia spoon. He suspected she'd have a few choice comments about the service and decor. As for Mr. Bentley, Adrian had no real read on him yet. He knew the man by reputation only, an up-and-coming policy advisor who aimed to win hearts by bridging the gap between City Hall and community activists. If he could help open the door to a larger grant or a permanent health center, then Adrian would gladly endure a lukewarm cup of coffee in a tight-lipped diner. A few moments later, the bell over the door jingled again. In walked Ms. Jackson, wearing a colorful scarf and carrying a heavy tote bag filled with pamphlets. She spotted Adrian and gave him a warm nod before taking the seat opposite him. Immediately, he felt a sense of relief. Her presence brought energy into the space. She reached across the table and gave his hand a quick squeeze. "Morning, Dr. Carter," she said, voice bright. "This place is cozy." He chuckled softly. "It's quiet and off the beaten path. Thought we could talk without interruptions." Miss Jackson scanned the diner. Adrian watched as her eyes paused on Carlene, then moved to the other customers. A subtle lift of her brow told him she caught the atmosphere. Ms. Jackson was no stranger to these microdynamics. She'd been advocating for justice since before Adrian had finished med school. Before they could settle in further, Carlene approached, pen hovering over her notepad. "Ready to order?" Ms. Jackson, unbothered by the waitress's curt tone, smiled politely. "I'll have a coffee with cream and sugar, and a bowl of grits, please." Carlene nodded, turning to Adrian, who merely raised an eyebrow. He decided not to dwell on the earlier delay. "I'll have the same," he said. "Except black coffee for me." Without a word, the waitress left. Ms. Jackson let out a small sigh, leaning forward slightly. "It's always something," she said softly, not needing to elaborate. "But we persist, don't we?" Adrian nodded. "We do," he answered simply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folder, the agenda for today's discussion. He tried to focus on that, rather than the tension in the air. They had important work ahead, connecting hospital resources to the community, identifying young talent, and guiding them into medical fields, ensuring that proper healthcare wasn't just the privilege of a few. A few more customers trickled in, and Adrian caught a glimpse of Mr. Bentley through the window. The liaison approached, checking the address on his phone, then stepping inside with cautious optimism. This was it. The beginning of a conversation that could, with effort and courage, reshape a piece of the world. As Bentley headed their way, Adrian took another sip of coffee and allowed himself a private moment of reflection. He was here, in a humble diner, dressed in simple clothes, confronting the same small frictions that had been part of his life from the start. He was wealthy, powerful, and influential, but still human, still vulnerable to the quiet judgments and assumptions of strangers. With each breath, he reaffirmed his purpose: to use his position not for comfort or praise, but to carve out space where kindness and opportunity could flourish. If that meant starting here, over bitter coffee and hesitant smiles, so be it. He glanced at Ms. Jackson and then out the window to the neighborhood beyond. The day was young, and so was the work ahead. This was just the beginning, and Adrian was ready. He had built a life of service and success. Now he would use it to lift others, one small step at a time. Mr. Bentley entered the diner with an air of mild uncertainty, tugging at the lapels of his summer-weight blazer. He was a tall, lean man, mid-40s perhaps, with a trim beard and a pair of glasses perched low on his nose. Adrian watched as he surveyed the scene: scuffed linoleum, humming fluorescent lights, and the three of them seated in an out-of-the-way corner. Miss Jackson raised her hand in greeting, and Bentley approached, flashing a practiced smile. "Dr. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "Good to finally meet you in person. I've heard a lot about your work." Adrian stood to shake Bentley's hand. The city liaison's grip was firm but polite, and for a moment, Adrian dared to hope this conversation would be smooth. Maybe Bentley's polished demeanor would be an asset, helping cut through bureaucratic red tape. Still, Bentley's eyes drifted ever so slightly, scanning Adrian's simple attire. Faded polo, no tie, no suit jacket. Was there a flicker of doubt in his expression? Adrian couldn't be sure. It was a look he'd seen often enough from those who expected something else, something more visibly important. When they pictured a prominent surgeon and philanthropist, Ms. Jackson cleared her throat, settling in. "We appreciate you coming here, Mr. Bentley. We thought an informal setting might help keep things candid." There was a subtle emphasis on candid, and Adrian knew Ms. Jackson wanted to ensure everyone felt at ease. The subtext: let's strip away pretense and talk about what really needs to be done. Before they could get started, Carlene returned with their orders. She placed Adrian's bowl of grits and black coffee down a little too abruptly, earning a raised eyebrow from Ms. Jackson. The waitress then set Ms. Jackson's meal down gently and, with a forced courtesy, asked Bentley if he wanted anything. He ordered a coffee, looking slightly uncomfortable. Adrian took a quiet breath and reminded himself that he was here for bigger reasons than a rude waitress. Bentley pulled out a folder. "I reviewed the preliminary proposal you sent, Dr. Carter. The idea of a mobile health clinic serving underserved neighborhoods is compelling. However," he paused, adjusting his glasses, "we may face challenges securing permits and, well, convincing certain stakeholders." Adrian tilted his head. "What sort of challenges?" Bentley shrugged lightly. "There are concerns about cost-effectiveness, about whether the initiative can truly be sustained long-term, and I've heard some chatter that we might need to prove the community interest is genuine." Ms. Jackson leaned forward, her voice firm. "Community interest is not the issue. These neighborhoods have been asking for better healthcare access for years. The concern is whether the city will do what's right or continue to ignore these pleas." Bentley inclined his head, trying to appear sympathetic. "I understand, but I'm not the only voice at City Hall. And some of my colleagues, well, let's say they're looking for certain reassurances." Adrian nodded slowly, pushing aside the sting he felt. He knew what certain reassurances often meant. A bureaucratic code for saying those in power needed extra proof when it came to helping predominantly black and brown neighborhoods. He kept his composure, though a quiet anger sparked in his chest. If he lost his cool now, he'd play right into their preconceived narratives. The doorbell jingled, and 2 police officers stepped inside, scanning the diner. They carried themselves with that detached alertness of people who see everyone as a potential problem. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped haircut, locked eyes with Adrian momentarily before turning to the counter. They appeared to be on a break, maybe just grabbing coffee, but their presence brought a slight tension to the room. Adrian thought of how often a uniform meant scrutiny, especially for men who looked like him. Ms. Jackson began outlining some of the community work that local volunteers had done to drum up support for the mobile clinic. Petitions signed, testimonies gathered, local barbershops and churches offering their parking lots as sites. Bentley tapped his pen on the folder, nodding but not quite committing to anything concrete. Adrian took a spoonful of grits, the warmth settling in his stomach, grounding him. He reminded himself to remain patient. Good intentions alone wouldn't move the needle. They needed buy-in, and unfortunately, that often required navigating through biases. As they talked, Carlene refilled Bentley's coffee cup promptly when it was only half empty, but ignored Adrian's empty mug. Ms. Jackson caught Adrian's eye, and he gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He wanted to focus on the business at hand, not wage a battle over a coffee refill. The slight insults and lapses in courtesy stacked up like thin sheets of paper, light but persistent, reminding him he was out of place in the eyes of some. Bentley leaned in. "Dr. Carter, have you considered approaching a private donor to fund the initial rollout? City Hall might be more comfortable matching funds if the project has corporate or philanthropic backers." Adrian almost laughed. Corporate backers. He himself had the resources to fund a large portion of this initiative, and he planned to do so, but why should a basic healthcare service depend on private goodwill rather than public responsibility? He swallowed the bitter taste of frustration. "Mr. Bentley," he said, voice measured, "I've already secured a significant portion of the funding I'm prepared to invest both my personal wealth and connections from the Carter Fellows program. What I'm asking from the city isn't just money, it's support in reaching those in need, permits, coordination, outreach." Bentley nodded, brows lifting with mild surprise. "Your personal wealth? I see." He still looked at Adrian's casual attire and the modest surroundings, as if trying to reconcile them with the idea of someone who could personally bankroll a medical initiative. "That might help," he admitted. The police officers paid for their drinks and ambled toward the door when something outside caught their attention. Both lingered near the window, hands resting on their belts. The tension in the diner rose a notch. Adrian glanced outside, noticing a group of teenagers skateboarding on the corner, laughing and occasionally cheering when one pulled off a trick, nothing threatening. Yet the officers lingered. Mrs. Jackson spoke quietly. "We'll need city support sooner rather than later. The community's trust has been eroded enough by inaction. Dr. Carter's involvement can help bridge that gap, but we need action." Bentley set down his pen. "I'll take this back to the team," he promised, though his tone suggested caution. "I'm glad to know about your financial readiness, Dr. Carter. But I have to be honest. There's skepticism. People want to know what's in it for you." Adrian straightened slightly, meeting Bentley's gaze head-on. "What's in it for me is making sure my patients don't have to travel across town for adequate care, that young people see themselves as future doctors and nurses. I've dedicated my life to this work. Not every return is financial." For a split second, Bentley's eyes softened. Maybe he understood, or maybe he still doubted. He began gathering his papers, an unspoken signal that he would soon leave. Suddenly, the diner door swung open with a jangle. One of the officers stepped back inside, addressing Carlene. "Ma'am, we got a call about some loitering and potential solicitation outside. You seen anything suspicious?" Carlene's gaze drifted, then settled on Adrian's table. It was subtle, but there, a flicker of thought, as if deciding whom to single out. Adrian's stomach clenched. He felt Miss Jackson stiffen beside him. Carlene shrugged. "Not really," she said finally. "Though we've had some people come in and out this morning." She looked pointedly at Adrian and Miss Jackson's booth, as if unsure of their business there. The officer followed her gaze. "Sir," he addressed Adrian, voice calm but authoritative, "can I ask what brings you to this establishment today?" Adrian's heart rate quickened. He was doing nothing wrong, just having a meeting over breakfast. Yet here he was, singled out. He took a steady breath before replying, "We're having a business discussion. Is there something I can help you with, officer?" The policeman, arms now folded, stepped a bit closer. Miss Jackson put a hand on Adrian's arm under the table, a grounding gesture. Bentley looked between them, uncertain. "We received a complaint," the officer said, his voice lower now. "Just checking if everything is all right," Miss Jackson interjected, her tone polite but firm. "Officer, we're community representatives and professionals here on legitimate business. Who complained about what?" The officer hesitated, then shrugged, avoiding specifics. He looked Adrian over again. "Just doing our job with all due respect, sir. Are you a resident of this area?" Adrian met that gaze steadily, willing his voice to remain calm. "I grew up near here. My family's home is a few blocks away. I have every right to be here." Bentley cleared his throat. "Officer, I'm with City Hall, and Dr. Carter is a well-regarded surgeon in this city. We're meeting Ms. Jackson to discuss a healthcare initiative." The officer blinked, surprise flickering across his face. "Oh, a surgeon." He glanced at Adrian, as if seeing him anew. Adrian could almost sense the man's disbelief and recalculations. How often had his credentials provided a protective shield? And yet, how often was he forced to rely on them just to be treated with basic respect? The policeman nodded slowly, stepping back. "All right, if there's no issue, I'll be on my way." He turned and left, leaving a charged silence behind. Mrs. Jackson pressed her lips together in frustration. Bentley looked uncomfortable, as if he'd just witnessed something he couldn't quite process. Adrian said nothing for a moment, feeling the anger simmer beneath his outward calm. This was the reality. His appearance alone had drawn suspicion. Even here, in a run-down diner, discussing philanthropy, he had to justify himself. It was exhausting. "I'm sorry," Bentley finally said, voice soft. "That was uncalled for. Adrian held up a hand. "It's fine," he said, though of course it wasn't. "This is what people face every day. This is why we need that clinic. Healthcare isn't just about medicine, it's about trust, about showing up for communities that constantly feel scrutinized and underserved." Ms. Jackson nodded, her eyes shining with restrained anger. "Exactly. This is what we're fighting against, Mr. Bentley, the subtle bias that wears us down." Bentley swallowed, adjusting his glasses again. "I'll do what I can," he promised, though his voice wavered. Was he shaken enough by what he'd seen to push harder in City Hall? Adrian hoped so, but he couldn't be certain. Outside, the teenagers were gone, the sidewalk quieter. Carlene hovered by the cash register, avoiding their eyes. Adrian wondered if she had made that complaint call, or if someone outside had done so. It hardly mattered now. The result was the same: an intrusion, a moment of forced defense in a simple morning meeting. Bentley slipped his papers back into his briefcase and stood. "Thank you for your time. I'll schedule a follow-up meeting once I talk with my team. We might consider a public forum or a small pilot run first." Adrian nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Let's keep the lines open. We need progress." Bentley left money on the table for his coffee and hurried out, head bowed slightly. Perhaps he'd carry this moment back to his office, reflect on it, and realize that the city's reluctance to support their initiative was not just about budgets and permits. It was about a system that too often viewed people like Adrian and Ms. Jackson with undue suspicion. With Bentley gone, Ms. Jackson turned to Adrian. She placed her hand gently on his, her tone compassionate. "You okay?" He exhaled, slow and steady. "I'll be fine, just tired of this narrative." He stirred his now cold coffee, suddenly not hungry. "But we keep going. This is exactly why we can't give up." Ms. Jackson nodded. "We won't. If anything, this meeting showed Bentley a slice of what we face that might help. Let's hope he carries this weight back to those who need to hear it." Adrian leaned back in the booth. The sunlight outside was brighter now, reflecting off passing cars. He felt the weight of disappointment, but also a resolve that hardened like steel in his chest. This battle wasn't new to him. He'd faced prejudice in med school, in the hospital halls, in boardrooms. He'd navigated again here. They would make this clinic happen, and if they had to shine a light on the biases and injustices standing in their way, so be it. People would see. They'd see that no matter how much he achieved, the world still tried to put him in a box, and they would see him break free of it, again and again, using his skill, his money, and his determination to carve out a better future. Ms. Jackson tapped the folder on the table. "What's next?" Adrian squared his shoulders, looking at her with unwavering confidence. "We strategize. We prepare for that follow-up. We gather more community support. If the city drags its feet, we'll show them that the people are ready, and we'll make them ask themselves why they're so resistant to doing what's right." She smiled softly. "Sounds like a plan." Rising, she offered her hand, and Adrian took it gratefully. They stepped out into the sunlight together, leaving behind the stale diner air, the suspicion, and the unspoken judgment. The day was still young, and their work had only begun. The following afternoon, sunlight poured onto the worn steps of the Cypress Falls Community Center. The place was old, but cared for. Colorful murals along the exterior walls depicted scenes of neighborhood unity. Children playing jump rope, elders sharing stories on porches, street vendors smiling over simmering pots. Today's event, a hastily organized public forum on the proposed mobile health clinic, had drawn an impressive crowd. Word had spread quickly, fueled by local radio announcements and Ms. Jackson's relentless advocacy. People filed inside, murmuring anxiously, hopeful that real progress might be made. Adrian Carter stood just inside the double doors, surveying the crowd. His heart hammered, with a combination of nerves and determination. He wore a simple dress shirt and slacks this time, slightly more formal than the day before, and his crisp, quiet confidence showed in the way he held himself. Ms. Jackson stood at his side, greeting arrivals, answering questions, and occasionally placing a reassuring hand on someone's shoulder. The sense of solidarity in the air was palpable, despite the underlying tension. They had invited city representatives again, Bentley among them, and had also reached out to local hospital administrators, activists, and even a few reporters. Adrian's goal was to make sure everyone knew this initiative was serious, that it wasn't just idle talk. He wanted the city to see the faces of those who needed better access to healthcare. He wanted them to understand that denying support to the mobile clinic would mean turning their backs on these very real, living communities. But as the hall filled, Adrian couldn't ignore the prickle of unease traveling up his spine. Outside, he'd noticed two squad cars parked along the curb. The officers, one of whom he recognized as the same cop from the diner incident, lingered, speaking to each other quietly. He had a bad feeling. They weren't just here to keep the peace tension simmered in the city these days, and whenever low-income neighborhoods demanded something better, authority figures sometimes responded with intimidation. Bentley arrived late, slipping in through a side entrance with a strained smile. He approached Adrian and Miss Jackson, adjusting his tie. "I'm glad to see the community turnout," he said, voice guarded, "but the atmosphere seems charged." Miss Jackson nodded. "People are tired of waiting. They want assurances today." Adrian looked Bentley in the eye. "We'll present our plan clearly. We have research, cost breakdowns, even personal testimonials. The city needs to show some goodwill, too. We're counting on you." Bentley swallowed, removing his glasses to wipe them. "I'll do what I can, but I can't promise immediate approval. There's resistance higher up." At that moment, the hall's overhead lights flickered, then steadied. Ms. Jackson stepped onto the small stage, tapping the microphone. "Welcome, everyone," she began, voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. The crowd quieted. "Thank you for coming together today. This forum is about the proposed mobile health clinic, an initiative to bring quality, accessible healthcare directly to neighborhoods that need it most. We're honored to have Dr. Adrian Carter with us, who's personally pledged support and resources, and we're pleased that Mr. Bentley from the city has come to listen." Adrian took the microphone next. He spoke simply and clearly, outlining his vision. A fully equipped medical van, staffed by rotating physicians and nurses from Latham Memorial, offering routine checkups, vaccinations, prenatal care, and more. The crowd murmured supportively. Several families nodded along, and a few elderly attendees wiped their eyes, hopeful at last. But as Adrian spoke, the door swung open with a heavy thud. Two uniformed officers stepped inside. One was the same officer who'd questioned him at the diner, and the other, a bulkier man with stern features, was introduced to Adrian's memory as Officer Daniels. Daniels had a reputation around these parts. Tough, unsmiling, and known to harass anyone who lingered too long in the wrong areas. Their presence brought a hush over the room. Ms. Jackson continued calmly. "We'd like to open the floor for questions and comments." She gestured to a microphone stand set up in the aisle. A local pastor rose, voice shaking slightly. "We have seniors who can't drive across town to see a specialist. The mobile clinic could mean the difference between catching a condition early or suffering quietly." Applause rippled. Adrian nodded encouragingly. Then a commotion stirred near the entrance. Officer Daniels had stationed himself by the door, arms folded, scanning faces with narrowed eyes. Adrian tried to focus on the speakers, but he could sense the officer's tension. Like a coiled spring, Bentley fidgeted nervously in the front row, now flanked by a couple of city clerks who had just arrived. Something felt off, as if the stage was set for a confrontation. Another resident stood up, a young mother cradling a toddler. "I spend hours waiting in clinics where nobody speaks my language, and appointments take months. A mobile unit could come to our community center, where volunteers can translate, where we feel safe." More applause. Adrian felt hope spark inside him. This was compelling testimony. Bentley had to be seeing that this was not just his crusade. It was what the people wanted. Then Officer Daniels cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me," he called, loud enough to cut through the meeting. He stepped forward. The audience turned toward him, bristling. "We've received a report," he said, voice booming, "that this gathering may be unpermitted and causing a public disturbance." Ms. Jackson's eyes flared. "This is a community forum, there's no disturbance here." Adrian set his jaw. "We're well within the community center's guidelines, we're not blocking traffic or causing any harm." Daniels snorted. "We'll see about that." He scanned the crowd, and his gaze landed on Adrian. "You again," he said, loud enough for all to hear. The officer advanced, making sure the onlookers noticed. "Seems like you're stirring folks up." The room buzzed with indignation. Ms. Jackson stepped between Daniels and Adrian. "Officer, we're discussing healthcare access, nothing illegal. We have every right to be here." Daniels loomed over Ms. Jackson. "I suggest you step aside, ma'am. I'd like to talk to Dr. Carter here." Adrian felt a flash of anger. He was tired of this intimidation. He glanced at Bentley, hoping the city liaison would intervene, but Bentley looked pale, uncertain. The whole crowd watched, tension thickening the air. A reporter aimed her phone camera at the scene, and Adrian realized this might turn into a public spectacle. Just what the city powers might want to discredit the clinic, or sow doubt. Adrian raised his hands, palms open. "Officer, we're holding a lawful meeting. No need for intimidation." Daniels squared his shoulders. "Is that so? We got an anonymous tip that some folks here might be planning to incite unrest, protests, property damage. I recognize you from yesterday, Dr. Carter. Why don't you produce some ID and explain what exactly you're doing, organizing these people?" A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. "He's a doctor," someone shouted. "He's trying to help us." Miss Jackson's voice trembled with controlled fury. "Officer, you're harassing a respected member of this community." She gestured at the attendees. "Look around. These are families, elders, working people." "You think we're plotting a riot?" Daniel's partner whispered something to him, eyes darting nervously at the growing tension. Adrian could sense the situation spiraling. If he resisted or argued too forcefully, it could give the officer an excuse to shut this down. He remembered the lessons of his parents. Keep calm. Keep your dignity. Don't let them provoke you. Yet, inside, his heart pounded. He was furious, humiliated, and worried about how this would reflect on the project. He reached calmly into his wallet and produced his hospital ID badge and driver's license. Holding them where Daniels could see, he said, "I'm Dr. Adrian Carter, neurosurgeon at Latham Memorial Hospital. I am also a private citizen with a vested interest in improving community health. That's what I'm doing here." Daniels peered at the ID, then turned it over slowly, as if expecting something incriminating. The silence in the room was profound. Then, he lifted his chin and said, "Funny thing, doctor. We got word that someone fitting your description was seen soliciting funds under false pretenses." He spoke louder, addressing the crowd now. "That's a serious accusation. Could even be fraud." Adrian's pulse spiked. Soliciting funds under false pretenses. The idea was absurd. He funded things himself. He had no reason to scam anyone. This had to be a dirty tactic, an attempt to smear his reputation in front of the community. Bentley stood now, palms raised. "Officer, that's nonsense, I can vouch." Daniels cut him off. "Let's step outside. Doctor, we can sort this out at the station." Miss Jackson thrust herself forward, voice ringing out. "You're not arresting him. He's done nothing wrong." Several attendees shouted in agreement. Phones were out, recording Adrian's mind. Raced. If he allowed himself to be hauled off without protest, would that dispel the lie or cement it? He needed a strategy. Fast. He forced a level tone. "Officer, I have records and witnesses proving my financial integrity. I have letters from hospital administrators, city officials." He flicked his gaze at Bentley. "And even from members of City Hall acknowledging my philanthropic work. This is a baseless claim." Daniels smirked, as if pleased to watch Adrian squirm. "We can clear it up downtown." The crowd surged forward a step. Ms. Jackson gripped Adrian's arm, fear and anger shining in her eyes. Bentley looked horrified, caught between loyalty to the city bureaucracy and the blatant injustice before him. Camera phones flashed. Someone started chanting, "No justice, no peace." The room's energy crackled, threatening to boil over. Adrian had to think of a way out that wouldn't end in chaos. He locked eyes with Bentley. The liaison knew the truth. He'd seen Adrian's resources, heard his intentions. This was a test of Bentley's character. Would he stand by or speak up? Bentley cleared his throat. "Officer Daniels," he said, voice shaking slightly but audible. "Dr. Carter has been in discussions with my office. He's provided financial statements and proposals. I can confirm he's no fraud." He stepped forward, placing himself between Daniels and Adrian. "If you arrest him, you'll be making a grave mistake. The city can't afford that kind of backlash." Daniels' nostrils flared. For a moment, it seemed he might double down. The partner glanced nervously at the crowd, at the recording phones. Perhaps they hadn't anticipated so much scrutiny. Daniels leaned in close enough for Adrian to smell his aftershave. "All right, doctor. Maybe we'll let you off this time. But keep in mind, we're watching." His voice, low and threatening, carried the weight of centuries of systemic bias, a promise that even wealth and stature wouldn't shield Adrian completely. As Daniels backed off, the crowd exhaled collectively. Ms. Jackson took the mic again. "You see?" she said, voice trembling with emotion. "This is what our neighborhoods endure: suspicion, accusations. We came here for health care, and instead we're treated like criminals. How much longer must we fight for basic respect?" Applause thundered through the hall. Adrian stood at the center of it, heart still pounding. He watched Daniels push through the crowd and exit, face like a thundercloud. The partner followed, looking embarrassed. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, as if part of the city's ongoing discordant symphony. Bentley looked at Adrian, clearly shaken. I'll bring this back to the mayor," he stammered. "This can't go on. We need to move forward on the clinic. The community needs something positive right now." Adrian nodded, straightening his back. His anger hadn't subsided, but it had tempered into a hard resolve. The city wanted them to fold, to give up. They wanted him to prove himself again and again until he got tired and walked away. But he wouldn't. He had not chosen the path of service because it was easy. He'd chosen it because it was right. Mrs. Jackson put a comforting arm around him, and he could sense her pride. "They tried to break us down," she whispered, "and failed. Now we show them our strength." The crowd was chanting again, this time in support of the clinic, in support of Adrian and Miss Jackson's efforts. The hum of energy rattled the old building's beams. Adrian cleared his throat, signaled for the microphone, and faced the people. "We're not backing down," he said. "We have the skill, the funding, and the will of the community. We will build this clinic, no matter the opposition, and we will ensure that every single person in this neighborhood has access to care." Cheers erupted, filling the hall with hope and defiance. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had crystallized into a purpose. In these charged moments, Adrian realized the stakes. Not only must he fight for a healthcare initiative, he must also challenge the system that constantly tried to silence voices like his. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle. This was bigger than him. He would not fail. At that thought, he noticed Bentley slipping away through the crowd, face grim. Perhaps Bentley realized now that this was no simple negotiation. The system was rotten at its core, and Adrian was about to dig right into it, exposing corruption and prejudice. The battle lines were drawn, and the next step was clear. As the forum ended, supporters approached Adrian and Ms. Jackson, shaking hands, offering solidarity, pledging to spread the word. But Adrian's mind raced ahead. Daniel's threat still echoed in his ears. "We're watching." Good, he thought grimly. Let them watch. They would see him stand strong. He would not yield. The warm afternoon light slanted through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the charged air. Adrian stood amid friends and neighbors, chest tight with purpose. He knew the climax loomed just ahead, a confrontation that would demand everything he had. This was no longer just about a clinic. It was about justice itself, and he would meet it head-on. Adrian Carter could feel the pressure mounting from all sides as evening shadows stretched across Cypress Falls. The day after the public forum, he found himself alone in his small home office, reviewing documents spread across his desk, funding proposals, community surveys, and personal testimonials from locals who needed the mobile clinic. A single lamp illuminated the pages, while outside, distant sirens and muffled city noises reminded him that the world had not paused just because he was under siege. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. Officer Daniels' harassment at the forum had been a shot across the bow. Bentley's tentative support, while appreciated, wasn't solid enough to guarantee success. Adrian drummed his fingers on the table, thinking of Ms. Jackson's unwavering resolve and the community's hopeful faces. He needed a new tactic, something that would force the city's hand and expose the ugly underbelly of resistance. His phone buzzed. It was Mitchell, a name he hadn't expected to see on his caller ID. Mitchell Johnson, one of the mid-level hospital administrators at Latham Memorial, had been cordial but distant with Adrian in the past. He was known to keep his ear to the ground about City Hall politics, Adrian answered, heart pounding. "Dr. Carter, sorry to bother you late," Mitchell said, voice low. "I have to warn you, there's talk going around that the city is considering an injunction to block your mobile clinic project altogether. They might cite public safety concerns or unregulated medical practices." It's all nonsense, of course, but they're scrambling to find something that sticks. Adrian closed his eyes, anger simmering. Do you know who's pushing this? A council member named Radcliffe, and some behind-the-scenes players who don't want the wrong kind of attention on certain hospital funding discrepancies, Mitchell replied. They're nervous your clinic would highlight the city's neglect. Also, there are rumors Officer Daniels is feeding them exaggerated reports, claiming your group stirs unrest. If this goes through, they'll not only block the clinic, but might damage your reputation. Adrian's grip tightened on the phone. Thank you, Mitchell. I appreciate the tip. After hanging up, Adrian paced the room. They were escalating their tactics. He had to move fast. He drafted a quick message to Miss Jackson explaining the situation. Her response came within minutes. We won't let them do this in the shadows. Let's bring everything into the open. I have a contact at the Tribune who might be interested in running a story. Exposing corruption publicly was risky. It could provoke harsher retaliation, but what choice did they have? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He needed to force the city to defend their stance in the public eye, under the bright spotlight of scrutiny. And if Daniels and his allies were twisting the narrative, Adrian would twist it right back by providing facts, figures, and first-hand accounts. Early the next morning, Ms. Jackson arranged a meeting at the local radio station's cramped studio. The host, a young journalist named Raina, had covered community issues before. When Adrian and Ms. Jackson arrived, Raina's eyes were determined. Doc, Ms. Jackson, Raina said, ushering them into the studio. I've heard what happened at the forum. People are outraged. The phones are ringing off the hook. They want to know what's going on with the clinic. Adrian settled into a squeaky chair, microphone before him. We need to set the record straight, he said. As the on-air light glowed red, he spoke directly to the city. Our initiative is transparent. We have funding, medical oversight, and community support. Any claim that we're causing unrest or committing fraud is a lie. We challenge anyone who doubts us to review our documents, and to come meet the people whose lives will be improved. Ms. Jackson added her voice, detailing how systemic neglect had led to unequal healthcare access. She described how minor bureaucratic hurdles became insurmountable when paired with implicit bias and distrust. In the control booth, Raina nodded vigorously, sensing a big story. But as they walked out, Adrian spotted a figure leaning against a lamppost outside, a familiar silhouette with broad shoulders and a stern face. Daniels. The officer seemed to be everywhere, watching Adrian's every move. The man offered no greeting, just a tight-lipped glare before moving on. A chill ran down Adrian's spine. This wasn't just about a policy dispute anymore. It was personal. Later that afternoon, Ms. Jackson texted Adrian. The Tribune piece runs tomorrow morning. Bentley says City Hall is in chaos. Good. Let them feel the pressure. Adrian headed to Latham Memorial, determined to shore up support among doctors and hospital staff. In the long, bright corridors, a few colleagues offered encouraging nods, but he also noticed anxious looks. Some people feared backlash from the city politics, and healthcare had always been uneasy bedfellows. In the cafeteria, Adrian found Mitchell again, nursing a coffee. Mitchell lowered his voice. They're desperate, Dr. Carter. Rumor has it, Daniels might try something more dramatic. Maybe arrest you on some manufactured charge. They want to break your resolve before the Tribune article hits. Adrian's jaw clenched. If they wanted a showdown, they'd get one, but not on their terms. He had to be strategic. He texted Miss Jackson and arranged a small press gathering in the open air of a local park. Neutral ground and very public allies from the community center, a few sympathetic medics, even a local pastor agreed to show up. The idea? Let the world see him standing with the people he aimed to serve, documents and credentials in hand. As evening approached, the park's lush green lawn and quiet benches offered a stark contrast to the tension crackling beneath the surface. About 50 people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Healthcare now," and "Stop the injustice." A pair of independent reporters milled around, cameras ready. Adrian stood under a large oak tree, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ms. Jackson stepped forward, her voice carrying, "We're here to show transparency. We have cost breakdowns, medical supply agreements, and partnerships with qualified staff. This clinic can start helping people next month if the city grants the necessary permits." Adrian held up a folder of documents. "Everything is here. No fraud, no hidden agenda. Just help for those who've been ignored." The crowd murmured supportively. And then, as if summoned by their defiance, sirens wailed in the distance. Adrian turned to see 2 squad cars pulling up onto the curb. Officers stepped out, and yes, Daniels was among them, face set in grim determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniels called out, "this assembly is not authorized. Disperse immediately." Ms. Jackson shouted back, "This is a peaceful gathering in a public park, officer. We have a right to be here." Daniels sneered. "You're inciting unrest. We have complaints from local businesses that this gathering is blocking foot traffic." Adrian looked around. The park's paths were clear. They hadn't blocked anything. The accusation was ludicrous. He stepped forward, raising his hands calmly. "Officer Daniels, we are here peacefully, and we have every legal right to assemble." Daniels' hand hovered near his holster. A ripple of fear moved through the crowd. Adrian's heart hammered, but he stood firm, refusing to back down. He would not give them the satisfaction of panic. A reporter edged closer, camera rolling. "I'm placing you under arrest, Dr. Carter," Daniels said, voice tight. "You're charged with organizing an unpermitted rally and obstructing public order." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Ms. Jackson shouted, "This is outrageous." The pastor shook his head. Furious Mitchell, who had slipped into the gathering quietly, looked pale and stunned. Adrian's mind raced. If he allowed the arrest quietly, they'd parade him like a trophy of disobedience. But if he resisted physically, he'd give them ammunition. The cameras were on. The public was watching. He realized a third option: truth and courage. He stepped closer to Daniels, making sure everyone could hear. "Officer," he said, voice resonant with calm authority, "I am a surgeon at Latham Memorial. I have worked to save lives in this community for years. I am here to improve healthcare access, not to cause trouble. This charge is baseless." Daniels smirked. "Tell it to the judge." Adrian took a deep breath. "I will. And I will bring every piece of evidence to show that this is intimidation, plain and simple. When I stand before that judge, I'll expose the lies you've told, the fear you've tried to sow, and the people here." He swept his arm to indicate the crowd. "Will stand with me. This is not just about a clinic now, it's about our right to demand better, our right to exist without fear." The crowd erupted in support, some chanting Adrian's name, others calling out, "Shame!" At the officers. Daniels flicked a glance at the cameras, his confidence wavering. He hadn't expected such a public display of unity. One of the younger officers hesitated. "Sir," he whispered to Daniels, "maybe we should stand down. This is getting too big." Daniels rounded on him, furious, but uncertain. He wanted to break Adrian's spirit, not spark an even bigger outcry. The tension could be cut with a knife. Ms. Jackson stepped beside Adrian, lacing her arm through his. "We stand together," she said simply. Adrian's voice dropped low, meant only for Daniels, but still audible to those closest. "Arrest me, if you must. But understand this, you're not just arresting one man, you're fueling a movement. Every camera here is capturing your abuse of power. By morning, the Tribune story will break, and people will know the truth. You'll have to answer for it." Daniel's eyes flickered. He stepped back, grappling with the weight of that threat. The sirens' echoes had died, replaced by a tense silence. Finally, the officer lowered his head slightly. "Everyone disperse," he muttered, voice sullen but retreating. "We won't press charges at this time, but consider this a warning." With that, the officers backed away toward their cars. Relief spread through the crowd, mixed with fury. Ms. Jackson let out a shaky breath. The reporters rushed forward, capturing every reaction, every word. Adrian stood taller than before, adrenaline coursing through him. He had faced down not just a man, but a system intent on silencing him. The stakes had never been higher. He'd come within moments of being hauled off in handcuffs, his name dragged through the mud. Instead, Daniels had blinked first, but Adrian knew this was only a partial victory. The city might still pursue the injunction. They might still try to sabotage the clinic behind closed doors. If he wanted true change, he'd have to push harder, dig deeper, and bring more people into the fight. Now that this confrontation had played out so publicly, there was no turning back. He would push forward relentlessly, using every resource at his disposal. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world grew dim. But in the faces around him, Mrs. Jackson's tearful pride, Mitchell's wary admiration, the reporter's newfound interest, and the community's fervent hope, Adrian saw a light that couldn't be extinguished. He would not let them down. The night sky settled over Cypress Falls as the crowd slowly dispersed. Still abuzz with energy, Adrian held the documents tight under his arm, aware that he stood at the precipice of a defining moment. Tomorrow, when the Tribune article was published, the city would be forced to react, and he, strengthened by this trial, was ready to meet them head-on. The next morning, Cypress Falls stirred with anticipation. The Tribune's exposé had hit the stands. A front-page feature spotlighting the mobile clinic project, the city's inexplicable foot-dragging, and disturbing accounts of intimidation. Photos from the park confrontation caught Officer Daniels mid-threat, and quotes from community members highlighted the desperate need for accessible healthcare. The article didn't just inform, it demanded answers. By midday, a special hearing was called at City Hall. The official line was that the council needed to review the permits and address community concerns. But everyone knew what this was. A make-or-break moment. The hall's small auditorium overflowed with reporters, community members, hospital staff, and city officials. There were murmurs of tension in every corner. Adrian Carter arrived wearing a suit, a subtle armor, and carried a binder of meticulously arranged documents. Ms. Jackson accompanied him, her expression fierce and protective. Seated on a raised dais at the front were several council members. Bentley was at the far end, looking pale and resolute. In the center sat Council Member Radcliffe, the rumored architect of the injunction. And near the back of the room, leaning against a wall with a casual menace, was Officer Daniels in full uniform, arms folded. He caught Adrian's eye and smirked, as if to say, "You're on my turf now." Radcliffe cleared her throat, tapping the microphone. "We are convened to discuss the proposed mobile health clinic. Dr. Adrian Carter, please step forward." Adrian approached the lectern. The click of his shoes against the polished floor echoed like a countdown. He'd prepared for this. He had records of his funding, endorsements from medical boards, and statistics on the community's healthcare deserts. But he knew facts alone wouldn't suffice. Today was about courage and laying bare the city's corruption. Before he could speak, Radcliffe waved a hand dismissively. "Dr. Carter, the city has serious concerns about the safety and legitimacy of your operation. Anonymous reports suggest you're inciting unrest. We must be certain this clinic isn't a front for other activities." A ripple of anger passed through the crowd. Ms. Jackson scoffed loudly, and some attendees hissed. Adrian raised his chin, voice steady. "Councilmember Radcliffe, you have my financial statements, certifications, and letters from Latham Memorial's leadership. Every piece of this initiative is above board. The so-called unrest comes from a community frustrated by neglect, not from me." Radcliffe smiled thinly. "Be that as it may, we've heard conflicting accounts. For instance, Officer Daniels," she gestured toward the back, "has filed reports indicating that your gatherings border on illegal rallies. He suggests your supporters have been aggressive, perhaps even threatening city property." Adrian's eyes narrowed. This was the confrontation he anticipated. "I'd like Officer Daniels to present these claims himself," Adrian said, voice carrying clearly. He turned to face the back, the entire room following his gaze. "Officer, will you share your evidence?" Daniels pushed off the wall and sauntered forward, taking his time. His boots thudded heavily on the floor, each step a provocation. The crowd parted, giving him a wide berth. He stopped beside Adrian, close enough for Adrian to smell the faint hint of aftershave and old coffee. "I don't owe you anything, Doctor," Daniels said quietly, though his voice carried. "But for the council, I'll say this. I observed Dr. Carter leading gatherings without permits, encouraging people to defy authorities, and refusing lawful instructions. A man like that. Who's to say what else he's hiding?" A murmur of unease spread through the crowd. Adrian's heart pounded, but he forced a calm smile. "Officer Daniels, I have multiple recordings, from reporters, citizens, and the community center's security cameras, showing that we never blocked public access or threatened violence. Those videos were provided to the council this morning." He looked up at the dais. "Did you review them, Council Member Radcliffe?" Radcliffe shifted uncomfortably. "We're still in the process. But we must consider the officer's sworn statements. Adrian cut in, his voice firm but respectful. Sworn statements must be corroborated. The Tribune article highlighted discrepancies in Officer Daniels' past reports. I also have documents, obtained through a records request, that show complaints filed against him for racial profiling and harassment. Are we to take his word as the sole truth when his record is questionable? A hushed gasp. Daniels' eyes flashed with anger. He stepped closer, and for a breathless moment, Adrian wondered if the officer might lash out physically. The tension was razor sharp. Cameras flashed. Ms. Jackson stood up from her seat, ready to intervene if necessary. Radcliffe cleared her throat, desperate to regain control. This hearing is about the clinic, Dr. Carter, not about Officer Daniels' record. Adrian faced Radcliffe, voice rising with conviction. The clinic and these tactics are intertwined. Officer Daniels' intimidation and your reluctance to approve this project are connected. The community doesn't trust your judgment because the system you represent has repeatedly undermined their well-being. Daniels let out a low, menacing chuckle. Watch yourself, Doctor. Adrian turned to face him fully now, eye to eye. No, officer. You watch yourself. We've exposed your baseless accusations. This community needs healthcare, not fear. Your attempts to paint me as a criminal are failing. Everyone here can see it. A tense silence fell over the room. For a split second, no one moved or spoke. Then Daniel sneered and reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a folded paper. He held it up as if brandishing a weapon. Failing? You say I have here a statement from a concerned citizen claiming Dr. Carter tried to solicit funds illegally. The tension soared. Adrian had known about these lies, but hearing it now, at the climax of this standoff, tightened a knot in his gut. He didn't flinch. Produce your witness, Officer Daniels. Let them testify under oath. Let them face cross-examination and show their proof. Daniels hesitated. He glanced at Radcliffe, who looked away. That flicker of uncertainty was all Adrian needed. Can't produce them, can you? Adrian pressed. Because they don't exist. This is a ghost story you've concocted to block progress. A reporter stood up, camera trained on Daniels. Another scribbled furiously on a notepad. The officer was cornered, and everyone sensed it. Bentley rose from his seat on the dais, gathering his courage. Council Member Radcliffe, he said, voice trembling slightly. I've seen Dr. Carter's financials. They're legitimate. His intentions are genuine. We should be asking why Officer Daniels and others have gone to such lengths to discredit him. Radcliffe's face went pale. She drummed her fingers on the table. We must maintain order, she declared, avoiding Bentley's gaze. This hearing is spiraling out of control. Adrian took a step toward the dais, leaving Daniels behind him. He raised his voice so all could hear. Councilmember Radcliffe, you claim to protect the city. Yet, under your watch, communities suffer without basic health care. You allow intimidation instead of dialogue. Today, in front of these witnesses and the press, I ask, will you approve the permits and let the clinic operate? Or will you continue to stand behind fabricated charges and corrupt practices? A thunder of applause erupted from the audience. Ms. Jackson raised a fist in solidarity. Mitchell and a few nurses from the hospital cheered quietly. The council members exchanged anxious glances. Radcliffe's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew the optics were disastrous. If she denied the clinic now, it would appear as a blatant endorsement of Daniels' smear campaign. Yet approving it meant admitting defeat. At that moment, Adrian felt Daniels looming behind him. The officer's breathing was audible. Adrian half expected an attack, some last-ditch attempt to silence him. Instead, Daniels spoke through gritted teeth, low enough that only Adrian could hear. You think you've won, Doctor? I've seen men like you toppled before your fancy degrees, your money. None of it matters. I can make your life hell in 1,000 quiet ways. Adrian turned slightly, not backing down. Try if you must, he whispered back. But every step you take in the dark, I'll bring into the light. Daniel's nostrils flared. For a moment, their standoff felt like it could erupt into violence. Then, a reporter flashed a camera, snapping them both in profile. A symbol of this conflict frozen in time. The officer stepped back, his posture rigid, as if forced to retreat by the sheer weight of public scrutiny. On the dais, Radcliffe sighed, leaning into the microphone. "We need time to review all of this," she said carefully. "But given the new evidence and public sentiment, I suggest a temporary permit be granted for the clinic's pilot phase. Further evaluation will follow." The room erupted in noise, some cheering, some shouting for immediate full approval. Ms. Jackson beamed through tears. Adrian remained composed, though relief washed over him. It wasn't a complete victory yet, but it cracked open the door. Daniels seethed quietly in the back. His true nature had been put on display. Baseless accusations, intimidation, and a refusal to produce any genuine proof. The city's dirty laundry was airing out in public, and the tide was turning. It might not be an instant, sweeping triumph, but Adrian sensed he had shifted the balance. As the council members filed out, Radcliffe avoiding eye contact and Bentley offering a meek smile, Adrian walked slowly down the aisle. The crowd parted, patting his shoulders, thanking him, begging him not to give up. Ms. Jackson rushed to his side, grinning. "You did it," she said softly. He nodded, but his stomach churned with lingering doubt. They had a temporary permit, sure, but who knew what sabotage might come next? He had confronted Daniels publicly, exposed his lies, and forced the council's hand. Yet the battle lines remained. Would Daniels retaliate, quietly undermining the project? Would Radcliffe find another excuse to shut it down later? As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, Adrian realized he stood at a crossroads. He had fought back, revealed truth, and won a partial symbolic victory. But the future was uncertain. The city's power structures wouldn't crumble overnight. This was just the beginning of a long and grueling fight. Adrian looked around at the hopeful faces, Ms. Jackson's trust, Bentley's cautious relief, and the community's guarded optimism. He'd earned this moment, but the real test lay ahead. He would need to keep pushing, keep exposing corruption, keep using every skill and resource he had to ensure the clinic's survival. He took a deep breath. The confrontation had peaked, and he remained standing, unbowed. For now, that would have to be enough. Still, uncertainty gnawed at him. Everything hinged on what happened next, on how the city responded, on whether Daniels would stay lurking in the shadows. Adrian Carter stepped forward, each step echoing the unresolved tension of a battle not fully won. His heart heavy yet determined, he moved toward whatever came next, ready to face it head on.